punctual. We've had a really good conversation tonight, so we're going to get started. For those of you who I don't know, who are new to Run for Something, my name is Amanda Littman. I am one of the co-founders and the executive director of Run for Something. I am so excited for tonight's conversation and tonight's event. I want to do real quick some housekeeping, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again. If you are joining and you want to participate in the chat, make sure to do so with the setting all panelists and attendees. You can see that above where you enter your information. That way everyone can see and participate. We'll ask you to abide by the Run for Something Code of Conduct. It's very straightforward. Don't be an asshole. If you are, we will kick you out. And we can drop links to that as well as we go. I know folks from our team are there to drop links to anything we reference or information. So we're here to help you and make sure you really get the most of this conversation tonight. If you have a question for our illustrious speakers this evening, make sure to use the Q&A function down here, depending on what side of your screen I'm on. Use that to ask your questions, and David and Keegan-Michael Key will be able to answer them a little bit down the road. For those of you who are new to Run for Something, I want to give you a very quick debrief on what we do, who we are, and what the organization you're supporting is all about. Run for Something recruits and supports young, diverse progressives running for local office across the country. Since launching in January 2017, we have helped recruit more than 52,000 young people in all 50 states who said they want to run for things like school board and city council and state legislature and sheriff and DA and water board and library board. And as we have seen, especially over the last 3 or 4 months, and especially over the last week, these local offices are critical. These local offices make quite literally life and death decisions. And these local offices are the building blocks for a stronger democracy that fights for everyone, not just rich old white men. No offense to the rich old white men who are here. Since launching, we have endorsed more than 1,100 people across all 50 states. Our endorsed candidates are more than half women, are nearly half people of color. They're about 20% LGBTQ. They are incredible. They are Judge Lena Hidalgo in Texas, who is single-handedly flattening the curve in Houston by making sure that people have to wear masks. She was the one that issued the stay-at-home order, while the lieutenant governor was on TV telling seniors they should sacrifice themselves to save the economy. We work with Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy in Virginia, who helped ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, who expanded Medicaid to 400,000 Virginians, who is fighting hard now for the most vulnerable communities in Virginia. We work with Tay Anderson. Tay is a member of the Denver School Board. He is 21, he's now run twice. He is leading protests in Denver. He's been tear gassed, he's been shot at with rubber bullets, and he is stepping up and showing what leadership looks like, using his position on the Denver School Board to help end the Denver School District's relationship with the police department. Similarly, in Minneapolis, the school board member who led that resolution in that city is Josh Pauley, one of the alumni we've worked with before. It is unbelievably inspiring and hopeful and gives me so much joy, and it's such a privilege to get to work with people who decide that they see a problem in their community and they want to do more than just talk about it or post about it or even vote for it. They want to literally put their names on the ballot and run themselves. They want to change their lives, change their careers in order to change their communities and ultimately change the world, because they understand that democracy is a participatory sport. That if you want to change our democratic systems, you have to become a part of them. Not just from the outside, although the protests and the activity and the activism is such a critical piece of this, but at the end of the day, we do have to elect people who then make the decisions, and the activism gives the space for that. It is a collective effort to make true change. And it is something that I found really helpful in David's book tonight that we're going to discuss, and that him and Keegan-Michael Key will dig in on. I am so excited for this conversation. Before I introduce our incredible panelists this evening, I would be remiss in not doing my job very well if I didn't remind you to please contribute to Run for Something. For those who already have, it means a lot to us. Thank you for your generosity. For those who haven't, we're hoping you can step up. 5, 10, 20 bucks goes a really long way for us. We'll have about 700 candidates on the ballot this cycle. They are running for things that we know make a difference. And we're really excited to be able to support them, but we can only do that with your help. So whatever you can do, it means a lot to us. With that, I want to introduce our 2 speakers this evening, and then I will jump away until the very end. First, the author David Litt is the New York Times bestselling writer of Thanks, Obama, My Hope He Changed You White House Years. It is a phenomenal book if you have not read it. He previously wrote speeches for President Barack Obama. He was described as the comic muse for the president. After leaving the White House, he served as the head writer and producer for Funny or Die. He's currently developing a sitcom based on his life in DC. I assume it involves lots of cats. He frequently appears on cable if you are someone who watches a lot of that. I'm really excited. His new book, it comes out this week, next week?
Next week.
Next week. It is
June 16th, so 10 days, roughly.
10 days. It is amazing. If you haven't yet, you should pre-order it. Go to bookshop.org to buy it, or go to a local Black-owned bookstore and pick it up. It is really phenomenal. He'll be joining conversation with Keegan-Michael Key, an award-winning, Emmy and Peabody Award-winning actor, writer, producer. He can be seen hosting Game On CBS and National Geographic's Brain Games. He starred in a bunch of movies. You may be familiar with him from Key and Peele, or as portraying Luther, President Obama's anger translator at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We are so excited to have you both here and to have this conversation. And with that, I will be whooshed away, and I'm really excited to listen in.
There we are. Hey, David.
Hi, Keegan. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. It's probably better if we're gonna have a conversation for me to be unmuted, so
Yeah.
that yes, right.
That's one of the keys.
I wanted to say hi. I haven't seen you in a while, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today, and thank you for Run for Something for allowing us to have this forum tonight, because I think it's going to be really exciting to talk about your book, David, which is just phenomenal and so wonderfully accessible. And I figured maybe you and I would just, well, I'll just ask a couple of questions and we'll just see where this thing goes. And we'll talk for a little while, maybe half an hour. And then we welcome, guys, all of your questions. We're gonna have a Q&A section toward the end. So about half an hour from now or so. And then we can all have a big, nice, substantive conversation together, which I'm actually very excited about. So you're good today? As good as one can be expected?
Someone asked me the other day, they said, how are you? How are things? And I was like, I'm good. Things are not so good, but I'm fine. And yeah. I think that's the best we can hope for these days.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny, in light of everything that's been going on, I think one of the only things that we're certain of right now is that this is one of the most important weeks in the history of this country. I certainly think so. And something that came up to me in my mind was how has the research that you did for this book, how has that changed the way you see this moment that's happening right now?
Well, I think there's all sorts of ways it's changed the way that I see it. Before I get to that, I will say, for me, when my first book came out and when this new book is coming out, my goal was always just to have conversations with people I'd want to talk to, even if no one was listening, and to work with organizations that I'd want to support, even if no one was present. And so I'm so excited I get to do both of those things tonight. And hopefully here in DC, I don't know how many of you all watching are in DC, but it is, we're now getting torrential rain just to go along with all the other stuff. So you may hear some thunder and lightning in the background just because, why not add some severe weather to all of the other things going on?
Well, that gives us a lot today. All right.
Yeah. So here's what I will say about the way that researching this book, which was kind of my attempt to create a schoolhouse rock for adults in the Trump era, how that affects how I'm looking at what's going on right now. And I should say, as a white guy, there is no way I would ever claim to have the answers to what's the things that are bringing so many Americans out on the streets right now. And I don't fully understand all the questions. And I want to go into any discussion of this with that kind of humility and understanding. At the same time, I would point to two things that I learned as I researched the way that our system of government really works. And the first is throughout, and you'll see this throughout the book, I was just so surprised by how carefully, how often, and the exact details of the way that racism and white supremacy have been woven into our political process. So to some extent, that's our history. Even things like voter registration, which you think of as just that's just a feature of American life. Well, it turns out in Texas, where I went to be part of a voter registration drive for the book, they did not have statewide voter registration until the 60s, but they passed a law in 1949, and they said, if we ever have to get rid of the poll tax for any reason, we're going to replace it with voter registration. So voter registration was specifically designed not to bring people into our democracy, but to keep people out. All sorts of stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah,
And that was the that's funny that's what it would never occur to me that someone would think of voter registration in that way. But that's amazing. I'm sorry, keep talking.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm like a New Yorker who gets really into this stuff, so I need to be stopped sometimes. So please do.
No, it's the book is really fascinating because and I can't wait for people to buy this thing because I love how you just described it. It is a schoolhouse rock for adults in the Trump era. That's the perfect lane for you to describe the book. I learned so many things, and I also learned things about things I didn't know that I thought I knew about, and then you would add a little tail on the end. I'm like, wait a minute, that's happening too, which was really, really helpful. And I think that the insight that people are going to gain from having this at their fingertips, especially right now, is really, really, really fantastic, and it's going to be crucial for this particular election cycle. What gave you the idea in the first place, or I should say, David, what inspired you to want to write a schoolhouse rock for adults during the Trump era? Where did that come from?
So I think a lot of us have the thing that we're doing because Trump got elected that we probably wouldn't be doing otherwise. Keegan, I know, you're super politically active this cycle.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you would have done that otherwise, but I'm sure that Trump getting elected certainly was a factor. We'll just put it that way.
Lit a fire underneath me. I will. Yes.
And I know Run for Something. It was one of the organizations that really came up in response to the Trump era. So for me, I ended up having this moment around the time Trump was inaugurated and saying, we all know that a majority of Americans picked one president and then we got another president.
Right.
But it goes deeper than that, right? So also a majority of Americans voted for one party's senators, and the other party was running the Senate. And in 2012, when I worked for President Obama on the re-elect, Democrats won the House, the national popular vote for the House, by 1%,
Mm-hmm.
and Republicans won the House by a big margin too. And so I kept coming back to this question. It kept coming back to Schoolhouse Rock and saying, wait a second, I loved that after school special. I loved, I'm Just a Bill, but they lied to me. Something doesn't seem right.
Right.
And so I decided I've never been a very good student. I became a speechwriter because I'm like very good at figuring out the bare minimum about something, but not a lot past that. And so then I decided, all right, I'm going to actually try to learn some stuff about this, and I'm going to try to convey what I've learned in a way that someone like me would read. So, one book or less is the promise of this book. And the idea is, if you don't want to read tons and tons of political science, but you do want to understand how we got here and also how we can fix it, hopefully, that's certainly the goal of this project was to create something that people could read, and it's entertaining, I would hope, but also relevant, really relevant to what we do to get out of this mess.
It is entertaining. I will say that. I want to back up for just a second because it's something that occurred to me as you were saying that racism and white supremacy is woven into the fabric of our nation. So would it be safe to say, or maybe you can characterize it in a different way, is that everybody who set the system up just had a head start? It's almost like they didn't even have a head start. They changed the game and then didn't tell anybody else the new rules. Does that make sense? Because if after the Emancipation Proclamation, nobody knew that they had Jim Crow in front of them, that was going to be the next thing, that was going to be the next chapter, and that Reconstruction was going to happen, all that historical stuff. So part of it is what you're saying, that we're finding ourselves in a situation where the game was fixed when it started.
I think that's exactly right. And I don't think that the answer is that the game is fixed in the sense that it's unwinnable. But the way you described it, I think, is perfect. That all through American history, you've had powerful people who want to just tilt the playing field, right? Or they want to say, okay, if this is a race between interests, between regions or parties or whatever, our team has a head start. And I think in the modern era, Mitch McConnell, who I'm sort of obsessed with, is the guy who understood that better than anybody. But he was not the first person to understand that one of the things about politics is that the players write the rules. And so if you're writing the rules and you don't care about fairness or ethics, then you can get a big head start. And I think that goes hand in hand in America with racism and white supremacy. And it's not just the historical roots. I mean, the other thing that shocks me about what is happening right now is that the exact same communities that are most likely to be victimized by police violence are also the ones who have had their voting rights under attack for years and in some cases decades.
Decades, yeah.
And so you have the system where people are being attacked, they're being victimized, and then we say, well, change the system. It's a democracy, but we're taking people's power to change the system away.
Right.
And my view is, obviously I'm a Democrat, but my view, and the reason I wrote the book, is not to say, here's how we make sure Democrats win every election. My view is to say, here's how we make sure that we all count equally in this democracy that we share. Yeah,
there's something that you mentioned in the book that I thought was that I liked a lot, which you were talking about, this notion that you didn't, I'm trying to think I'm going to paraphrase, that you had mentioned that it's not that Democrats would be, if everybody had a fair shake, it's not that Democrats would be in power forever. It's just that everybody would be represented equally. And then if you were someone in office and you were a libertarian or a Republican and you had a constituency that was growing and that was bigger, you might start to change your agenda to fit the constituency because you knew that that we were on this ideal level playing field.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think the clearest example of that is immigration. So in 2018, Rush Limbaugh, everybody's favorite, he was on Fox News and he said, I would be fine giving citizenship to every undocumented immigrant. I doubt he said undocumented immigrant, but you know what I mean. As long as a condition of that citizenship, they can't vote for 15 or 25 years. So in other words, what he was saying is, I don't actually think that immigration is bad for the economy. I'm not even that concerned about, I'm not even that concerned about white nationalism. What he was really concerned about was if immigrants become citizens, he's worried that people like him won't get voted into office. And my point is not that then Republicans would lose every election. My point is that if we had a pathway to citizenship for immigrants and they became citizens and could vote, which is what we've done in the past, then Republican politicians would have to listen to them. And right now, Republican politicians don't have to listen to them. And that starts to explain this basic question we keep asking over and over in the Trump era, which is, how can a democratic government do all these awful things to our fellow Americans? And the answer is in part because millions of those fellow Americans aren't really represented.
Right, exactly, right. And they don't have any, there's no, but the thing is, the hopeful thing is that we do have recourse. And we find a lot of that, we find that in your book, which is interesting that I like a lot of the historical stuff that you write about in the book. I love the, what's his name? Gary. What's Gary's first name?
Elbridge Gerry.
Elbridge Gerry, who is where we get, it's funny also, I thought it was a neat little tidbit that his name is actually Elbridge Gerry and not Jerry, even though he's the person that didn't invent gerrymandering, but we know him for that. And they're fun little historical tidbits here and there that I find absolutely fascinating. Was there one in particular that you loved more than anything in the historic space?
I think there's all sorts. I'm going to do one really quick and then I'll go into my real favorite. So one is that Poland has had a version of the filibuster, a kind of where anyone could veto a piece of legislation. And in Polish folklore, the first person to use their equivalent of the filibuster in the 1600s is so reviled that he's now like a Dracula type figure, that he's considered to have destroyed the Polish state in the 16 and 1700s. And in fact, now in like 7 languages, including Polish, the phrase Polish parliament translates roughly to what Americans would call a clusterfuck. So there's the idea of these kind of obstructionist tactics, they have ruined other countries. The other one that I would say is sort of just a weird tidbit from history that I found fascinating is that we talk about the Great Compromise. You probably learned about the Great Compromise in high school. And that's the idea that the House is distributed, representatives go to states based on the state's population, but that every state gets exactly the same number of senators, 2 senators. Right. And of course, that benefits small states over big population states. So Delaware was very, very insistent on getting this deal out of the Constitutional Convention. And the main proponent of ensuring that every state would be equally represented was a guy named Gunning Bedford Jr. Interestingly, there were 9 Gunning Bedfords in his family simultaneously. I have no idea why, but the whole family named everybody Gunning Bedford. This specific Gunning Bedford from Delaware showed up and said, if you don't take this compromise, then Delaware might just have to team up with France or England or Spain.
Oh, yeah.
Who knows what'll happen. And the craziest thing of all that is that Gunning Bedford Jr. was James Madison's college roommate at Princeton.
Yeah.
And James Madison was from Virginia, the biggest state, and hated the Great Compromise. And so I just think it's this amazing thing of, like, we talk about the Constitutional Convention. It is this extraordinary event in human history, but it's also this moment where these 2 former roommates just, like, hated each other. And I think that humanity, the more I learned about it, the more I felt like, okay, this has just all been people figuring it out. And that's our job, and that was their job.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, it's right. It's right. It's that it's finding a way. It seems like it's finding a way to, and I mean manipulate. I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, but to manipulate the rules in such a way that we can make it more fair, so that we can then change rules. Right? Does that make sense? Is that well characterized? I
think that's exactly right. Not to be rude, but I think John Adams put it best, where he described. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, government is the divine science of social happiness. And John Adams was, like, grumpy all the time. So it was very rare that he said something upbeat like this. But he described political science as the divine science of social happiness and said it is, I forget the exact phrase, but basically said every benevolent mind should endeavor after the best. So in other words, this idea of sitting down and saying, what should a government look like? How do we create a structure that helps create the kind of benefits to society that we want? That's not just a project for our founders. The way that John Adams and other people saw it is that's a constant project. That if you live in a democracy, the conversation we're having right now, the conversation, logging into a conversation like this one and thinking about these issues is one of the most American things you can do.
Why do you, now, Dave, let me ask you a question that's not on the book, just to kind of, why do you think we are so involved when the person that we voted for is not in office? Why all of a sudden do we get so mobilized when that, I mean, I personally believe Trump is an extreme case, but we seem to get very involved and sparked and motivated when the other party that does that, or any party or any politician who's not representing us seems to be at the fore.
So I would say this is actually, and I could be wrong here because I have no experience being a Republican, but I think this is a difference between Democrats and Republicans. And it gets to your first question that you asked about how I'm thinking about this moment. It also gets to the heart of the work that Run for Something is doing, which is, I do think, as much as I love the Democratic Party and my fellow Democrats, I think we have focused way too much on who the president is and not enough on everything else going on in America. So that starts with local elected officials. Not just because of issues like policing, which, those are often decided at the local level. President Obama pointed that out, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago.
Yeah.
But also, they're the ones who, as I'm sure most of you on this call know, they figure out what the districts are going to look like. They also figure out just the basics of how we're going to manage our elections. How many polling places do we have? How much do we pay our poll workers? All these little things that can make an enormous difference. But the other piece is, I think the Republican Party has done a much better job building these institutions, playing the long game. I mean, Mitch McConnell titled his memoir The Long Game, which is kind of horribly amoral, which fits perfectly. So I don't think that we should necessarily think about politics only as a game. I don't think that makes sense. But that long view is really important. I mean, if you look at, just to give one example of where this long game has really played off, we all know what is happening to the Supreme Court right now. We know it's tipped in this incredibly conservative direction. But that started in the 1970s. That was a project that really began in the 70s with getting into law schools and changing the way that law was being taught in law schools so that one day down the road, we would have a Supreme Court like this one. And most of the people who started that project are dead now. But they were like, we care so much about this, we're going to invest in it knowing that we may never see the fruits of our labor, which would be inspiring if it was like any other cause. But unfortunately,
yeah. God, that's interesting. I wonder, it's funny. It seems that those people who I think, that, like you said, most of them have passed, were living in a world that an idealism for themselves that was going. They felt the country was moving in the wrong direction horribly, and it's funny that instinctually they thought to play the long game. But also, if you're in the privileged class, I think sometimes you feel like you have the luxury to play the long game, whereas I think other people find themselves perhaps in crisis mode. We consistently find ourselves in crisis mode, and which is what these are the telltale signs right now. We're seeing it happen right now, which is unfortunate. But hopefully we can find a way to turn that around. I mean, I am very inspired by all these young people that run for something that are finding a way to make change on the ground in neighborhoods, in hamlets, in towns. I remember years back, when I lived in a different part of I lived in Los Angeles. I lived in a different part of Los Angeles, and there had been a death by an intersection. There was a particular intersection where there was a death, and it's a local election. It's local canvassing that allows people to put on a ballot and have a neighborhood council come together to have a stoplight put at that corner, and to see that work really lit a fire to go, oh my gosh, this is just as important. It feels just as important, just as vital as the presidential election or flipping the House. It was really fascinating. You kind of start your book. You kind of start talking about Schoolhouse Rock and I'm Just a Bill stuff, but then you get to this woman named Shelley Simons, and I'm curious, why did you start? Well, tell us who Shelley Simons is, because it's an interesting story. And why did you start with her story?
So Shelley Simons for a long time, she was a middle school Spanish teacher in Newport News, Virginia. And then she decided to run for office. She decided to run for the State House of Representatives in Virginia, where she lives. And she ran once and lost pretty badly, but then she ran again in 2017 against the same opponent. And her race actually ended up tied. And some of you may have read this story, remember this story, because not only was her race for, I think it's House of Delegates rather than, I forget exactly what they call the lower chamber in Virginia, but the lower one. Yeah. Her race for House of Delegates was tied, but the control of the entire House of Delegates went to the Democrats by a single delegate. So in other words,
it is the House of Delegates. I'm noticing here. It is definitely Virginia. It is confirmed is the House of Delegates. Right.
Okay.
House.
Thank you, Amanda. This is. I feel like the book was fact checked, but like I'm not. My brain is not.
No, your brain is not.
So I'm always a little bit like, I hope what I'm saying is what is in the book. I feel confident about what's in the book. So so what happened was, so her race was tied, and this tied race ended up deciding control basically of one branch of Virginia legislature, which then meant that unless the Democrats had all three branches, they wouldn't have the ability to pass all these laws. And of course, in 2019, Democrats did win back where they won all three chambers and have been able to do a lot since. But in 2017, because this race was tied, somebody kind of reached into a bowl and picked out a name out of a hat, and that ended up being the election.
Literally reached into a bowl and just pulled out a name. Okay,
yeah.
All right.
A ceramic bowl on loan from the Folk Art Museum, and that's how they decided it. And it's fun, and weirdly in like Nevada, for example, they do tied elections. You pick a card. So every state like has its own state specific way of figuring out what to do in a tied election, but none of them is terribly satisfying. The reason that I wrote about Shelley is I went down there and I talked with her about it, and what she said to me really stuck with me. She said, in our politics, it's not about who you can get to vote for you. It's not about who people vote for. It's about who votes. So she understood it as, yes, among the voters, my race was tied, but there were all these people who didn't vote. Right. And if one of them had voted, and I asked her, do you think among the non-voters you would have won? And she said, absolutely. That no question. If you look at the people who didn't vote, she would have won that group. And for me, part of the book was to say, when we look at those non-voters, we tend to be kind of judgy about people who don't vote. We tend to take a very small seat conservative view, like, oh, you must be lazy if you don't vote. Right. But there's a lot of reasons people don't vote. And instead of saying, how do we shame people who don't vote? I think we should be saying, how do we make voting easier and also more appealing for everybody so that everyone feels like I can vote and I can cast a vote that really matters.
Right. Yeah. That to me is the big thing, is that how do we get people to say, oh, this is just an easy thing. It blew my mind when I read the book and found out there are nations that have mandatory voting. In your brain clicks twice almost within nanoseconds. My brain goes, mandatory voting? That's preposterous. Wait a minute, mandatory voting? That would be the greatest thing that ever happened. And so, of course, there are going to be people who don't want that to happen. You visited Shelley Simons. You spoke with Shelley Simons. What was one of, here's the thing, folks, I'm jumping right in the question because there's some like juicy, really cool questions here. So I'm going to get into the questions. What was one of your weirdest reporting trips?
My weirdest, by far the weirdest reporting trip was I went to Louisville, Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
And I tried to crash a party at Mitch McConnell's old frat house.
Yeah.
And I don't even really know, even now, like why I did that. It was just like a moth to a flame. I was like, if I'm going to figure out how our democracy is, if it had been pushed to the brink like this, I guess I just need to like make a pilgrimage and start in Mitch McConnell's youth. And I went to a baseball game of his old high school baseball team where he almost became a star pitcher. And if he had, according to his memoir, he probably would not have gone into politics. So like,
it's the Fidel Castro story.
Yeah, exactly. I think other than Fidel Castro, and maybe including Fidel Castro, there has no one has ever been, history has never been so affected by like one baseball coach.
Right.
Like he got cut from his varsity team, and according to his memoir, that's when he turned to politics, to school politics, and then eventually, obviously, to bigger things. And so I will say, when I started my first book, I was like 29. Now I'm 33. It turns out that like walking around a frat house trying to get in somehow as in your 30s is a very different proposition than I had imagined. And so it didn't work. But the weird thing is there is a rumor at the University of Louisville that Mitch McConnell owns the land that his frat house sits on. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it was amazing just the way that even on campus, there is this sense of like, there's one set of rules for Team Mitch and there's another set of rules for everyone else. And whether, I didn't look at a deed, but there's this understanding that we're playing by different sets of rules in this country and even on one campus.
Amazing. That is amazing. And then the story, people, when you get the book, you got to read the book about the time that David spent with this kid, Trent. And it's very well written. It's very humorous, but also very enlightening. We have a question from Lisa Hicks Domansky, and she asks, how do we get young people to back the presumptive Democratic nominee?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know that I'm uniquely qualified or necessarily super qualified to answer it. I will say, obviously I worked in the Obama administration. I love Joe Biden, personally. So I still count as I'm like a late stage millennial, and it surprised everybody, but he's got my vote, so that worked. I think that more broadly, there are things that Biden can do, right? I think a vice presidential selection can help. I think, frankly, a lot of what Trump is doing right now is going to help a lot. Because if you look at the way that our system is set up, once you get to a general election, you really do only have two choices. And ultimately, and whether you like or hate this system, if you don't vote for one of the two people who is most likely to win, then you might as well not vote at all. And that's just the system we have. And right. I think Trump, I spent today, like everyone in DC has spent the last 5 days, right? I mean, if you're not out there in the streets even, which I was not today, you're still listening to Blackhawks just circling the city. On one hand, we're like having these chats about James Madison's crazy college roommate. And on the other hand, I'm living in a city, like so many of us are, that is occupied by its own military, which none of us thought would happen here. And so I do think that moments like that they do a better job than any speech or anything like that ever could of hammering home how important this election is. The last thing that I will say about Biden specifically is I do think when you look at the polling and the numbers, I suspect that Biden is not struggling with young voters as much as he is struggling with young voters on Twitter, as an example. I think that was one of the stories of the primary. So I think absolutely you got to get everybody. But I don't think that this is, a campaign. I think it's starting from a position of strength, and then you say, how do we build on that? Because the other thing is, it's not just a question of defense, right? How does Biden get all the young people? And this, I think, ties back into some of the turnout stuff I talk about in the book. If young people voted at anywhere near the levels of older people, especially with the divide that we're seeing now, we would just live in a totally different country.
Oh, completely.
And so that, I think, hopefully this is the election that really does it. 2018 was a really remarkable success story in terms of young people coming out and voting, as you all know. And I think if we can continue that, it's not just Biden who's going to benefit, it's candidates up and down the ticket.
Up and down the ballot, right. That is a perfect segue into the next question I want to ask, which first of all, you see Lisa says, thank you for your insights. So you were talking about, you mentioned in that last answer about us having ostensibly just two choices, really. So Rahul Rahatki asks, I hope I'm saying that right, Rahul. I hope I'm saying it's Rahul or Rahatki or Rahatji. I'm just going to cover all the bases. All right. How much does the entrenched two-party system skew true political representation? In many countries, there are at least 4 or 5 political parties, and you do address this a little bit in the book.
So, no question, we're at a point where there are moments where the two-party system has a bigger effect now than it used to. So Lee Drutman, who's a political scientist, and to just like plug someone else's book for a second, he wrote a book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop earlier this year. And the thing that he points out is—
What was his name?
Lee, L-E-E, Drutman. Here, I'm gonna jump in. I'm gonna jump into the chat.
Okay. Drutman, like D-R-U-T-M-A-N?
I got this.
Lee Drutman. Okay.
Lee Drutman. And what he talks about is that we didn't used to have a two-party system in the conventional sense, because you basically had 4 parties. You had the Northern Democrats, the Northern Republicans, the Southern Democrats, and the Southern Republicans. And so while we technically had 2 parties, and many states were really controlled by just one party, right? I mean, most of the South was controlled just by white conservative Democrats for a very long time. But nationally, we had a variety of different parties and interests, and they didn't all align perfectly. And now that's totally changed. And so one of the ways that I think we can fix that is with ranked choice voting. So for those of you who don't know what ranked choice voting is, and I do more of an explainer in the book, but the short version is you go into the booth and let's say, there's 3 of us running. So it's like me and you, Keegan, and then Run for Something, because that's the other name that I'm seeing up at the top of my screen here. So if the 3 of us are running, rather than just picking your favorite candidate, you pick your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. And then if your first choice comes in last, rather than your vote not counting, your second choice vote counts instead. And I know that sounds a little complicated, which is why I wrote it down, but it's not that complicated, and a lot of places have adopted it. I mean, New York City is doing it in local elections starting in 2021. Maine does it already. And people really like it. And the beauty of it is, especially for young people, where I think voting really is an expression of your values, not just a kind of transactional, we're going to try to pick the best choice, is that you can go into your polling place or vote by mail, and you can pick your favorite choice, and you don't have to worry about wasting your vote. And in many of those cases, that favorite choice might win, or a candidate might have a lot of second choice support from a lot of different people. So they win, even if they're not endorsed by one of our 2 parties. And as local elections get less competitive, because most cities at this point are blue, as local elections get less competitive, you want choices, but you don't want to have those only choices be between a Democrat and a Republican. So I think ranked choice voting is a great way for us to get what we want more often.
Gotcha. It's interesting that you say that, because then you probably still like your second choice, you still like your third choice, so that you may still be benefiting from whatever the final tally is, even if your first choice doesn't win.
Yeah. And it's a way of driving up turnout, because a lot of people, like I talked to Tiffany Bond, and I had to cut this from the book just for length, but Tiffany Bond ran as an independent in Maine. And she said a lot of people showed up to vote for me, but then their second choice was Jared Golden, the Democrat. And she thinks, and I don't think she's wrong here, that he won because of people who showed up to vote for Tiffany. But then on their ranked choice ballot, they chose him second. And so, and she doesn't think this is necessarily partisan. She thinks, although this may have changed, that a lot of people who would vote for her would vote for Susan Collins in the Senate election. but her point is just people show up to vote for their favorite candidate. And I saw Jacob asked how you get ranked choice on your local ballot, and a lot of that can be done through ballot initiative. So there's certain cases where you can vote directly on how the process is run, how your laws work, how your democracy works. That's what happened in New York. I believe that's what happened in Maine, although I'm not sure. And it's definitely something that happened around the country. People tend to like it.
Gotcha. Now this is a very interesting question. This is from Julia Friedman. I like this. It's like a thought question here. Can California, Massachusetts, Illinois, and New York team up and threaten to side with Mexico and Canada in order to get rid of the Electoral College? And it's funny that I say that because it echoes back to what you said about Bedford Gunning Jr.
Yeah.
Saying, screw it, we're going to leave. Delaware's going to leave, and we're going to join France. And then what are you going to do? The other rest of you 12 colonies, what are you going to do? What are you going to do, John Adams? It's like, it's a really interesting proposition.
I feel like at this point, though, we'd have to go to, Canada or Mexico and be like, will you even have us? Like,
Right.
it was, there's just a lot to unpack. So here's actually, I think, even better news is that we do not need to team up with any foreign countries to get rid of the Electoral College. The Electoral College, first of all, is just completely stupid. Like, I did this book in a spirit of intellectual inquiry. I would say almost every issue is complicated. The Electoral College is not complicated. It's just dumb. And it's not even always good for Republicans. It's good for Trump, but it was also good for Obama in 2012. He could have lost the popular vote by about 1.5 points, and he still would have won thanks to the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is basically just like Russian roulette in the middle of your democracy. There's most of the time nothing happens, and then every so often, like, there's this huge mess. And that's just, it's random and it's bad. As you can see, I don't like the Electoral College. But the good news about the Electoral College is you can't get rid of it without a constitutional amendment. But if you get enough states to team up, and something called the National Interstate Popular Vote Compact, I think that's right, is the way that would work is if you sign the compact, then your state, rather than giving its electors to the winner of the statewide election, it gives the winners to the winner of the national popular vote election. So if you get enough states to sign up for that, if you get 270 electoral votes worth of states to sign up for that, then by definition, the winner of the Electoral College is the winner of the popular vote. And I think we're only about 80 votes away. So it would be a couple more states and we could get there. And the biggest thing is just to remind people that small states are not benefited by this. Neither party is benefiting from this. The only states that are benefiting are a few swing states, and everybody else has their vote not matter. So everybody should be invested in getting rid of the Electoral College. In practice, I think we'll just have to wait till a Democrat wins because of the Electoral College, and then Republicans and Democrats will suddenly be like, yeah, this is a terrible idea. Let's get rid of it.
Oh, you really feel that it would be, if a Democrat is in the White House, then you feel that would happen. That there's a possibility that there'd be bipartisan support for abolishing the Electoral College.
If Republicans stopped thinking they're the electoral, I don't mean Republican voters, I mean politicians.
Politicians, I understand.
Politicians stopped thinking that the Electoral College benefits Republicans all the time, which it doesn't, then they would be very quick to get rid of it. I think it's not a particularly principled position.
Wow, interesting. Our next question is from Michael Hughes. This is a little change of pace here. He says, KMK, that is yours truly. Here's my question. I saw Meteor Shower, and how much fun was that? Okay, that was a play I did on Broadway. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a really great time every single night. And so I appreciate you asking me. He says, here's my real question. What are the prospects for modernizing elections, making Election Day a holiday, voting for mobile phones, and every single state using mail-in ballots, etc.? So where do we stand right now, and what looks like it's possible on the horizon?
So I'm going to give you the answer to this question that I thought about when I was writing the book, which I did not anticipate that there was going to be a pandemic, which is on me. And so right now, obviously the urgency is we need to get vote by mail, and we need to figure out how to make polling places safe. I mean, I just voted in DC on Tuesday, and I don't know if anyone else had this experience anywhere where they voted in a primary, but I voted by mail. It was pretty easy, but the lines were around the block. Right. And the thing that I think is really important to understand about voting is that convenience is not just about convenience. Convenience is about the integrity of our democracy. So just to give you one example of that, in 2012, on average, black voters waited 23 minutes to cast a ballot, and white voters waited 12 minutes to cast a ballot. So voting was twice as hard for black voters as white voters.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and as a result, a lot of voters, if you wait more than an hour, say, it's not just that you're more likely to leave the line, you're also more likely not even to bother voting the next time around. So year after year, what we think of as inconvenience is not mere inconvenience, it's actually keeping people from voting. And again, it's disproportionately affecting certain communities. And again, the communities that are disproportionately affected by everything else in American life.
Exactly.
So it's a very long-winded way of talking about the problem, but the solutions are, to me, number one, we have to do a better job of recruiting poll workers and training poll workers. And that's a very analog solution, but right now, I think over half of our poll workers are over the age of 60, especially with COVID. That's a really serious problem. We're having trouble recruiting enough poll workers. So in Cincinnati, what they do is they let high schoolers take the day off school, and you can go work the polls, and you get a day off, and you get a civics lesson, and you have these like eager young people who understand the technology running around, and everybody wins from that. So that kind of thing could go nationwide and make a huge difference. When it comes to tech, no question, voting technology is outdated. Like, this is a thing I never thought about, but when you go to vote on a voting machine, have you ever noticed that it never looks like a tablet? Like, it's
right,
a touch
yeah,
screen,
yes.
it doesn't look like a tablet. And that's because when that machine was purchased, tablets did not exist. The last time we really invested in voting technology was 2002. So we do need to update our technology, both for security and for convenience. And as I think we all saw in the Democratic primary in Iowa, we also need to make sure that every time you have technology, you test it, you train on it, and then you have a backup plan for what to do if that technology does not work. Because if you don't have a backup plan, you should just treat it as though the technology is worthless. You can have problems that are much bigger than the problems that you set out to solve in the first place.
Gotcha. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. So that we could get out there and volunteer at polling places. That seems like something that's one thing that we can definitely do.
Yeah. Normally, I think that organizers are, I was a field organizer in 2008, and, we're asking people, don't volunteer at the polling place, go knock on doors. I think in 2020 that may change a little bit, because we just need poll workers so that we can keep our polling places up and running so that everybody can go vote.
Gotcha. No, that makes perfect sense to me. Yeah. So Maura, this is another quick question. She said she attended another webinar earlier today on racism, where scholars of this subject talked about how we've seen protests on this issue before with little change in policy. Do you think that this week's events are sufficient to truly be a tipping point on this issue? So that, that's an interesting question. It's interesting. It's funny that I was just like, I'm going to answer as I have
I was going to ask you to answer, so this is good.
I really hope so. And the actual honest answer to the question is I don't know. There was legislation and change in the past when there have been protests. I feel like but the landscape of the world has changed, right? We watched bodies come home from Vietnam, and it affected people. And then that wasn't something that was prevalent during our these excursions we've had in an excursion. That's a very nice word. In Afghanistan, or even in the Second Gulf War. So that was something that the Republicans seemed to catch up to and go, we don't want public opinion souring on us. Now I feel like this feels like it did during the Vietnam era, and that there is a real possibility for some kind of change. The images that we're seeing are so undeniable and so horrific that I think that it will put a chink in the armor of our apathy. That's my feeling. I certainly hope so. So that would be my answer. Yeah. Teresa Yee. So she's asking a question. She's asking, what do you think about our two-party system? What do you think about it in your opinion of it? I find it so outdated and frustrating that I can want conservative financial policy and progressive social policy, but that kind of party doesn't exist. Isn't it time to have large multiple parties? Which I think you've kind of addressed a little bit, but I know exactly where you're coming from, Teresa. Yeah.
I do think that ranked choice voting makes a difference there, but I also think, I think it is frustrating, but I think that the question that I went into in the book was, as much as possible, how do we think about solutions that we can do within the system we have? And I think some things about the two-party system are very good and some things are not so good. But I think an important question that I kept trying to come back to is, for example, if we lived in a parliamentary democracy like Britain or Israel or Italy, you have lots of different parties and they're all, and then you have a prime minister. We're not going to switch over to that system. So how do you work within what we've got? And I think what we've got is good. I'm not like, oh, our founders gave us something, terrible. They didn't. I do think that is a challenge a lot of the time, and we have to figure out how to work within it. One thing that I think is interesting is a lot of the things that are biggest frustrations with the two-party system right now actually are that the parties used to be much stronger. They used to be much more powerful top-down organizations, and now they're actually weaker than they used to be. And so kind of paradoxically, sometimes we don't get the benefits of strong, coherent parties, and we only get the downsides because the parties have actually gotten weaker rather than stronger. That's like a whole tangent, but I think it's an interesting little tidbit.
Interesting. We have from an anonymous attendee a question for me. In your opinion, how could Hollywood be more effective or get more invested in the 2020 election? And here's my first response, and I don't mean this tongue in cheek. I think that I would love to buy a copy, or everybody in our community should have a copy of David's book. I really believe that. And based on an answer David gave 2 answers ago, I'm now feeling like, well, maybe I should volunteer to work the polls. Could you imagine, wouldn't it mean something if you went to your polling place and Brad Pitt was there at your polling place working the polls? Because before, I did not know we had a poll worker shortage until I read the book, David. So I wasn't aware of that. I think that finding ways for us to be really literate in the political process means that when people come to us and ask us questions, we find ourselves in a situation where we're adept to answer. We really can answer. I made a video a couple years ago for the 2018 midterm elections about provisional ballots and how people have to fill out provisional ballots if their name isn't on the voter rolls. I know that we didn't talk about, there's a guy in David's book by the name of Hans van Spakovsky, and he is the person that pretty much he's the grandfather of creating voter ID, which doesn't always exist. So sometimes people will try to match IDs, and you try to purge a voter by saying, well, your ID doesn't match the name on this roll. And you're supposed to then be allowed to ask for a provisional ballot. Now, this is something I learned about from friends. I sought that out. And then I read in David's book that sometimes the provisional ballots are also not counted. So there's other things that you have to do. So the more that our community can educate itself, and I really do believe reading this book would be a really effective tool. So, if Hollywood stars worked in polling places, it would really bring consciousness and bring awareness to at least that aspect of our system. So,
Keegan, I should just say, any answer that begins with "everyone should read this book," I think is very wise. Really, you thought this through. I wasn't sure, and now I'm convinced.
Yeah, I think the more you see people in our community volunteering in part of the political process, the more it just brings awareness to the community at large. So, here's a question from Max Terzano. He says, my parents have begun to ask a lot of questions about how our government works and why what is currently happening is happening. They have always voted Republican, but wouldn't be able to tell you why. It sounds like your book would be a good read for them. What would be the main message you would hope they would come away with? And I don't know how old Max's parents are, but I think it's a very, very interesting question.
The message, Max, I would say the message I would have for your parents is that no matter which party they support, the democracy, the system of government that we live in right now is not the one that they've experienced for most of their lives. And unless they're, maybe like in their 80s or 90s, that is almost certainly true. And along every dimension, our government has become less representative. And assuming that you're trying to put a little spin on the ball here and get them not to vote Republican in the future, I would say it is worrisome to me, and that's a little euphemistic, that the Republican Party has now organized around this idea of making our government less representative, making our democracy less small d democratic. And I think if you don't think that you can win elections with your ideas, then probably your ideas aren't very good. And I do think that that is a fundamental challenge to a lot of the Republican political establishment, is say, if these ideas are so great, how come you don't think that in a fair election people would vote for them? And I think,
Right.
how come you had to change our government along every dimension to make it harder for people to engage in the process, and to make just a couple of people who generally tend to be billionaires more powerful than ever before? And I think that is I'll put it this way: if Democrats were doing that, I would say I don't know that our ideas hold up, because it seems to me like we don't really have faith in them.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I kind of wanted to tackle maybe one more question, and then maybe have some closing remarks from you, David, if that's possible. Tam Chowdhury says, the events in past few days have shown us that a wrong person at the helm of the American state can exert excessive power on its people. For those outside the U.S. and immigrants here have experienced the disproportionate use of force from the American state. Do you think elections alone can guarantee a truly democratic society, or the fundamentals of our state system need to be altered?
So I think democracy is about so many different things, right? There's certainly a cultural element. I mean, you're seeing that now, slowly, too slowly, but you're seeing some Republicans start to waver on what they're willing to say about Trump. Most of them are retired. It's not enough, but you're seeing some semblance of a democratic culture assert itself. Hopefully it's enough. I do think, and I think this is a useful place to wrap up, I talked a lot about all of these problems that I looked into and uncovered and learned about, but I also say, time after time, what I found is almost all of these problems are solvable through the democratic process. It won't be easy, but I wrote this book thinking the next time we have the House, Senate, and the White House, or the next time, whatever state you live in, unless you live in DC, which needs to become a state, but if you get to live in a state, whatever state you live in is controlled by people who want to see the country be more democratic, there are ways we can do that, right? A single law could make voter registration automatic for everybody. We could get rid of these voter purges that are taking eligible Americans off the rolls. We could allow immigrants to become citizens so that they have a say in how the country's run. We could get rid of the filibuster. We could expand the Supreme Court to deal with the fact that Mitch McConnell has completely packed it. We could do all of these things, and it would only take a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the White House. So elections are not in and of themselves sufficient, and it's not going to be easy, but this is absolutely still doable. And to some extent, I think of this book as an alternative to the kind of cottage industry about learning about all the ways that democracies die, which I think is really important, but it's also important to learn how to keep a democracy alive before it's too late.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. We have about 2 minutes left, David. Was there anything you want to say to cap it off other than thank you, which has been...
No, I mean, this has been awesome. And Keegan, thank you for doing this. This has been very fun.
It's my honor, my pleasure. Mm-hmm.
I have avoided doing my Obama impression at any point because I know how much better yours is. And I will also just remind people that I am donating the pre-order royalties from the book to Run for Something. So I hope you have, now that you've heard about the book, you'll go buy it and read it. And if you do that in the next 10 days, it's not just supporting the book, but also supporting Run for Something, which is, I feel like the best way to put this message about how we fix democracy into practice is supporting awesome organizations like this one. So thank you all for listening. And Keegan, thanks again for joining us. And I saw a boo Eli Manning comment earlier, but I grew up in New York City, so I like the Manning jersey.
I would like to say thank you for all of you and all of the passion and the thought-provoking questions. And thank you, Amanda, so much for having us. This was really wonderful.
Thank both of you for doing this. Thank you for everyone who attended and who already contributed. I have 2, maybe 3 final asks for folks. One, please buy David's book. It is so, so, so good. If you can't get the pre-order link to order through Bookshop, I'm sure David's website has more information about it. It is phenomenal. Second, if you are able to contribute whatever you can to Run for Something, runforsomething.net/build. If you can't give, post it on social media, put it on Twitter or Facebook. Every single dollar matters to us. And third, final thing, if you're on this call, you're the kind of person that should run for office, we would love to help you. Runforwhat.net is the place to go. We will help you run for city council or school board or state ledge. Doesn't matter where you are or what your experience is. You're the kind of person who on a Thursday night thinks this is like a good fun evening. So you're the kind of person we need in elected office. So we would love to help you. With that, thank you everybody for joining. This is really great.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everybody, for
Bye.
practicing and practicing this democracy in this democracy. Yeah.
Agreed.
Take care.